I want to talk about capitalism in terms of looting, shooting, and polluting. A short time ago, I came home and my wife was telling me that Bloomberg seemed to be talking more about capitalism instead of using the term free market. A few days later, I heard about London, where people who were fed up with the current situation began looting the stores. I thought to myself, maybe that's what the free market would be, a place where people could go and get what they want, unhindered by any type of property relationships. And that got me to thinking about the expression that I used in the confiscation of American prosperity, in which I termed the chief activities of capitalism as looting, shooting, and polluting. Shooting becomes an essential part of the capitalist history in that capitalism first came into place by way of shooting. Yeah, I know there were capitalist relationships 10,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia, but in those places, capitalism had not taken hold as the core of economic activity. It occurred on the margins. If we think in terms of Western Europe, capitalism came by way of revolutions that deposed the feudal nobility. Looting was an essential part of early capitalism too. The English went to Ireland and then they went other places. The Dutch went to East Asia for their spices. Many countries went to Africa for slaves. This too was an essential part of the development of capitalism. Polluting was also a very important part, in that we associate the Industrial Revolution with the rise of capitalism. And we can see from the evidence that remains that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere rises very quickly with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, when people in Europe began to use coal more intensively. So all three of these things went together. I mention this because normally we think of capitalism as something that creates rather than subtracts. And of course we know that there has been enormous scientific progress. We know that our standard of living in comfortable areas for people in comfortable conditions has increased phenomenally. I'm talking to you with a computer linked by the internet. None of that would have been possible just a few years ago. The question then remains, how much of this can we attribute to capitalism, and how much could this have come about from a different kind of social order? But then we think about the computer itself, and we see that its origins come in terms of military research in a way to try to, at first, develop better methods for aiming artillery shells, and then finally for many other uses in which computers are used for espionage and for launching drones and all sorts of things. So looting, shooting, and polluting become very important. The polluting is doubly important because the wealth that we have depends upon access to raw materials, which also is very disruptive for the world. That is, we all hear about the coltan in our cell phones and the other raw materials. For example, recently the press has been covering the importance of the rare earth metals that happen to be produced largely in China, and for that reason there's a question about how important China should be in having the ability to manipulate access to these resources. And I began talking about this because I've been thinking of trying to do a series of books about I've been thinking of trying to do a series of articles and eventually a book about the nature of capitalism. And I wanted to begin questioning the idea whether capitalism is a zero-sum, a negative sum, or a positive-sum game. And I think in terms of the way that capitalism in many ways has preyed on other people, whether it was the African slaves, the displaced peasants, and so forth. And on the other hand, capitalism, as I mentioned before, has been very successful in managing to find ways to produce new and even wonderful kinds of technology. To answer the question about the relative strength of these different aspects of capitalism, I think it's useful to think about the nature of incentives in capitalism. Recently, because of the Dodd-Frank bill, banks have been thinking about ways that they can find new fees to replace revenue that might be lost because of restrictions on what banks could charge for things like overdrafts. Okay. Now, normally in the textbook you read about banks as being the way in which capital is distributed, in the way in which capital is being distributed efficiently. But that too is questionable. Here we get back to something Marx talked about called the mortal leap. And the idea of the mortal leap is that the capitalist has to put out funds before they can be invested. But of course, nobody knows what's going to happen at the end of the mortal leap. The capitalist can invest money in a factory that may take 5, 7 years to come into production. How does the bank allocate capital to this factory? We read in the paper in the last few days about a series of shutdowns of solar energy companies. Why are they shutting down? Well, they're shutting down because they cannot compete with the Chinese. Let me stop for a second. I want to make sure that this is recording. Okay. Sorry about that. So when the capital was allocated, the presumption was these solar energy companies would have radically new and efficient technologies that would allow them to be profitable. But by the time they came online, the Chinese had been so entrenched in the industry that it became difficult. It became very difficult for the American companies to compete, and they shut down. Now, it may have been that in the long run, somehow, that this investment was well directed. But the point is, the banks and capitalism in general have no way to understand how well directed that investment will be because of the time lag. Then we think about the other side of the banks and see them as, rather than being an efficient allocator of funds, that the banks may be better seen as an extractive industry, figuring out what sort of fees what sort of money that they can get from the public, not from doing something that would be necessarily serving more needs, but how they could figure out a way to extract some more funds. Just as the airlines similarly extract by charging for pillows, and who knows, one of the airlines was even thinking about charging for using the bathroom. They backed off that one. So how do we go about assessing the positive and negative in terms of the contribution of these companies? As to what extent are they serving the public's needs, and to what extent are they really just trying to extract what they can? My own suspicion is that on the whole they may be negative, but because of the gradual progress in information and knowledge that these banks and other companies are able to participate in a process that creates a better standard of living, or at least makes it possible to have a better standard of living for everybody. Seeing capital in this sense sort of bridges the gap between the polluting and the looting. Okay. Now, once we reach that point, then we can ask ourselves, what is it that capital does? And theoretically, capital competes with other capital to become more efficient. But then we watch around us and we see what's happening is capital is congealing into almost one solid mass. Surprisingly, the government has stepped in and put a roadblock in the AT&T merger with T-Mobile. That roadblock, I suspect, will be circumvented, and then we'll have T-Mobile take over. We'll have Verizon take over Sprint, and then finally Verizon and AT&T will work together, and we'll have one solid unit of capital. Now, Marx talked about how capital both competes and cooperates, but we're reaching a point that the cooperation and the competition are changing in their relative size. Now, part of the reason for this is that in the new capital structure that's being developed, the fixed costs, as I mentioned earlier in some of these videos, the fixed costs become very high, and the marginal cost, the cost of producing one more unit, becomes very low. And in that environment, competition becomes unsustainable. That is, if each one competes, trying to get more market, prices will be driven well below the cost of doing business, because competition will have people charging prices based on the cost of producing one more unit. Our NPR station here in Chico publishes an advertisement. Of course, they're not called advertisements on NPR. They publish an advertisement about a railroad that can take a ton of freight, 400 miles on a gallon of gas, a gallon of fuel. I forget the exact numbers, but it's a very, very surprising type of claim. And what it suggests is the cost of carrying one more ton of freight on a big railroad is almost nothing, just as the cost of carrying another passenger on an airline is trivial. So competition will drive prices down to those trivial costs, leaving the producer